Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to TANKFEST 2019. So now handing over for the Cold War warriors to David Willey, who's currently in the tower. David.
We're going to look at some of those Cold War era vehicles. It was that time when the capitalist West thought we might be going to the war with the Soviet-dominated communist East. And that meant it was led by Soviet Russia. Most of Europe, Germany of course, split in two, and the idea was, and again when we go back to that period, huge amounts of GDP money was being spent on keeping big armies out, mainly in Germany, in case the Cold War had become a hot war. And again, that idea that the West was fearful of a Russian invasion coming from the East, going through Germany, and therefore it was West Germany where most of the armies, or the NATO armies, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Western armies, based their troops in case that happened. So coming out, going around the arena, we've got a Leopard 1, we've got a PRTL, an anti-aircraft vehicle based on the Leopard 1, we've got a PZ-61, a Swiss tank. We've got the sandy-coloured looking T-72 tank. Following behind that, the enormous M103, the American super heavy tank. Then the American M60 tank, the British Army's Chieftain tank, and then the Challenger 1 tank. Now, we've got here, we're very lucky, we have the Dutch here in numbers today, and one of the vehicles we asked them to bring over is this vehicle, PRTL. It was called in Dutch military service. It's basically an anti-aircraft vehicle. The idea being that you've got there 35mm, what they call KDA Oerlikon cannons, two of them on the side of that turret. Originally, when it was built it was called Gepard for the German military, they use a Leopard 1 hull, but they actually put a car engine in the front on the right, and that's giving the power to a generator that runs all the electronics in that PRTL vehicle. Radar you can see spinning like a clockwork key on the back is out to detect incoming planes. There's another radar on the front of the turret that locks onto those planes out to 13 kilometers away, and when they're in range, normally about 5.5 kilometers away, those two cannons fire a really quick burst of fire. They can fire, I think it's about 500 rounds a minute. So you put two cannons together, that's 1,000 rounds a minute. That's a lot of fire going out of the vehicle. Bit of an oddity driving around, and what we've got there is basically the Swiss tank, the PZ-61. And you've got the British gun on it. We said about the 105mm L7 gun. They put a Mercedes bus engine in the back, but the rest of the tank they made out in Switzerland. Actually, they built the gun there under license. T-72's moved off now. It's putting diesel onto its hot exhaust, and that creates that white smoke screen we're seeing. The T-64 was a tank the Russians built, but it was so expensive they just couldn't make enough of them. So the T-72 was really a cheaper alternative to the earlier T-64 tank. 780 horsepower engine you can hear there, a diesel in the back of it. It's got a huge, great big 125mm gun, but as we've been mentioning, if you look at the profile of this tank, the T-72, much lower than the Western NATO tanks, and the reason behind that, they got rid of the loader. The loader's in a position he stands up in, so if you get rid of the loader you can make your turret lower down. And how they got rid of the loader, they put a cassette system underneath the turret, which has an auto loader system, so the gun has to come to a level position and a round is fed by a rammer into a barrel from a cassette. Think of like the old Kodak slide cassettes. Turns round, ammunition loaded, and it can fire. Now that M103 tank's moving off there. This is the tank I'm telling you about with the 120 gun that the Americans developed. We put a very similar gun on our Conqueror tanks for the same role. We're nervous about those Russian bigger tanks. Will the Centurions be able to cope with them? And so we built the Conqueror in Britain, put a 120mm gun on. The Americans built that huge, great big M103 with that massive casting on the top there, and again a whopping great big cast hull. Once they'd issued them, they were built in 52 to about 1954. They upgraded them in the late 50s, but very quickly they were passed on to the American Marines, because once that 105mm gun was put on the next generation of American tanks, the M60, really these tanks became redundant. And often happens in America, equipment that goes out of service with the US Army gets passed on to the US Marines. So for example, in the first Gulf War, you were seeing American M1 tanks being used by the American Army. The American Marines were still using M60 tanks. It's got a diesel. You can see that raised engine deck there at the rear, very similar to the same engine that's going in the M60. Only 38 rounds carried because they're so big. And this particular tank, it's in the markings of the US Marine Corps, and they were the people that actually gave it to the Tank Museum many moons back. Now the M60 starts developing in 1956. They're looking at it really for a replacement for the M48 Patton tanks. If you look at the American tanks after World War II, they're very much of a likeness. They just seem to be being developed as in getting bigger, more powerful guns on, very much like the T-tank series in the Soviet Union. Now, they were produced in the 1960s and 70s. They were kept going, they kept the factories going. They didn't make that many of them in one fell swoop, and part of the aim there was to keep the factories in business. Let's just keep some coming out, so should we need to produce a number of them, or if the world situation changes, then they can actually go into overdrive and they don't have to set up a brand new factory. The last produced M60A1 was made actually as late as May 1980. M60s, when they came out of American service, they were passed on to Greece, Portugal, Spain, Turkey still got them in service. So it's another one of those vehicles that we point out to the British Army, because we may see them out on the battlefield and they may be on our side still in the future. Now, we saw the Chieftain driving around earlier on. I mentioned about its gun kit not working, which is why the gun's locked over the rear engine deck at the moment. Chieftain, I mentioned before, main battle tank. The idea, we were putting all our efforts into one vehicle. Now, over in our shed, we've got what was nicknamed the 30-ton Cent. They took a Centurion and tried experiments with it. One of the experiments that was going on was trying a new type of turret. So instead of having a mantlet, the idea was going for this idea of a turret that comes more to a point, and instead of an outside mantlet like you see in many World War II tanks, the gun is actually located in a mantlet and trunnions, these bits that hold the gun inside the turret. And again, there's all that gun technology we don't see. We always hear about things like the sights, how you load it, actually holding on to the gun and managing the recoil of that gun is again very important. Why some guns have muzzle brakes, none of the tanks out there have a muzzle brake on, but we saw the 17-pounder on the Sherman with a round muzzle brake. The idea there is to capture some of the exhaust vent gases as they are vented forward behind the round, captures the gases, and it helps pull the barrel back forward so it's not recoiling as much. And on something like the Tiger, that muzzle brake, it took about 50% of the recoil of the gun. And again, that was really important. You weren't allowed to fire the gun if the muzzle brake was off or damaged, because otherwise the gun would recoil too far in the turret, smash equipment in there and probably break your trunnions. Now, we've seen the Challenger 1 already. I've mentioned its pedigree. Basically, it was a Shear 2 tank originally designed for the Shah of Iran. When he was deposed, the British government took over the project. Again, it's one of these issues, again, I mentioned earlier as well, reputations. The Challenger 1 tank, as it was called, it had adjustments made to it, but basically it was the same gunnery as the Chieftain. It had the new secret Chobham armour on. It had a new engine, a 1,200 horsepower diesel engine, CV12 Condor engine. It's got what they call hydropneumatic suspension, again, new type of suspension system. But at the time, it was fairly obvious it wasn't the tank that had been specified by the British Army. It was an adaptation. And it went off and it actually took part in something called CAT, or Canadian Armoured Trophy, it was basically a gunnery trophy. And it didn't do very well in that trophy, in that competition. Was it down to the crew? Were they trained properly enough? Did something else go wrong? Or had we got a complete lemon of a tank we were taking into service? Actually, the Challenger at the time gives great service. At the end of the battle, he was able to say he had 95% of his tanks were still operational. None had been knocked out by enemy fire. And again, famously, it was a Challenger that holds the record for the longest tank-on-tank engagement, armour-piercing, discarding sabot round fired by a Challenger 2 over a couple of miles away, takes out an Iraqi T-tank. And so he was able to go back at the end of the campaign to the Challenger factory up in Leeds and explain to the workers actually the Challenger 1 tank had done the business when it was needed. And again, that was very, very important to hear that, because no soldier again in the future, or anyone making these tanks, putting the energy and effort into them, wants to hear that you've made a bit of a lemon. And actually Challenger 1 did very, very well. And of course, a lot of the vehicles you're looking out there got a second lease of life after the end of the Cold War. So Leopard tanks were sold on to many countries, still in service. The British sold on their Challenger 1 tanks to Jordan. M60 tanks still in service. We did sell Chieftain into the Middle East. Iran used Chieftain, and some have been put back into service, re-engined, we've been told. T-72 tanks sold all around the world by the Soviets. Switzerland, amazingly, didn't sell. It gave away its PZ-61s to collectors and museums when they went out of service. T-72s, still a threat vehicle, and RT-72 there, the one you can see in the arena, is actually on loan from DSTL, Defence Scientific Technical Laboratories. We have another runner as well, and sign of the times, those vehicles go up onto Salisbury Plain, and they're used so that the modern British Army tank crews can sight on what a threat vehicle looks like. T-72 sold all around the world, about 20,000 plus out there, different models, not often the same build standard as the frontline Soviet Red Army was going to be using, but still a very, very threatening vehicle. So we need to know about it, and it's probably more likely we'll bump into these ex-Soviet T-tanks in future conflicts and pretty much anything else. So that's why the Army still needs to know, train, how they're going to knock them out. So there you've got a stunning lineup of post-war tanks.
Thank you, David. What a wonderful exhibition there of Cold War warriors.
If you like the videos here at the Tank Museum, then please subscribe on YouTube and support the Tank Museum on Patreon.